Monty, I think you're muted.
Yep. Apologies about that. Great start. But hey, everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to another episode of the Sticky Trades Live Wire Cryptx service. And today we want to break down some crypto assets for you, as well as take a look at the broader market. Some interesting moves over the weekend, plenty to discuss. And as always, I am joined by my esteemed co-host, CJ Reichel. CJ, how are you doing today, my friend?
Good. Interesting day in markets. I'm excited to talk about the macro cycle view as well as the short term. We have a death cross on the daily, so that's interesting, worth technicals talking about. But it's interesting. I think there's a case for both the bulls and the bears in the short term, but I'm looking forward to it because we got a lot to discuss.
Yeah, yes. Like you said, Death Cross, it's in the title of today's episode. It's definitely something worth noting. Historically, they've led to some pretty significant price action. So would you like to start with some BTC analysis and explain exactly what we're dealing with when it comes to this Death Cross?
Yeah, for sure. So before getting into the death cross, which is on the daily time frame, I want to talk about the weekly time frame because I think it's very critical. We're at a very critical point in terms of the Bitcoin overall 4-year cycle. And one of the check marks or checkpoints, I guess you could say, when looking for signs that the cycle is over, each time historically, when the weekly chart has closed below the 50-week moving average, which is this red line here, that has been the confirmation that price has entered a bear market. And last week, we did have our first close below the 50-week moving average throughout this entire 3-year expansionary period in Bitcoin. So that's just a fact. It's not something that I want to be too attached to, but bear markets are a normal part of cryptocurrency and Bitcoin's overall evolution. Same thing with the stock market. I mean, there's some interesting things we could talk about there as well, but I want to keep it on Bitcoin. But one thing that we've seen very often is that when we have a weekly close below the 50-week moving average, most oftentimes price does regress to the 200-week and kind of bottom out around there, or the 200-week has been generally a good place for Bitcoin macro accumulation. As you can see, that's coming up right at our level of about 60,000 and maybe even 65,000. So that would be a level that I would be interested in and longing from a macro cycle perspective. But as of now, just can't really touch it from that longer term investment point of view because, this is one of the confirmations that we are going into a bear market. Now, switching to the daily, there's that death cross. Death cross, just to reiterate, is when the 50-day crosses below the 200-day moving average. And that's a reflection of previous price action, right? Obviously, Bitcoin's down 20 to 25% in the last month. So the death cross is a reflection of past price action, which means very oftentimes we actually see price appreciation or a little bit of a pump into the 200-day moving average before creating more of a macro lower high before ultimately heading lower. So not a whole lot that's actionable from my perspective when it comes to those facts, but that's just what we have seen historically when it goes to either price closing below the 50-week and seeing that death cross on the daily chart. So,
Yeah, if you could up for just a moment. I want to point out our last Death Cross that we had.
let me reshare.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely worth noting because it did mark the bottom of the price action. Um, so looking at it back at our last Death Cross that I see they just circled, that did ultimately mark the bottom. So although I remember the sentiment was very negative at that time. It was probably the most overwhelmingly negative sentiment we've had in quite some time, and price rebounded from there. So don't think that this is necessarily the end of the world. And I actually want to paint a little bit more of a bullish picture here and talk about something that I think is very important, and that is on-chain data. CJ, if I could just add this to the stage.
Yeah, go ahead.
So this is the number of balances with more than 1,000 Bitcoin. So that's what we'd classify as the whale. And as you can see, we saw a big uptick in the amount of wallets that have more than 1,000 Bitcoin. And you can kind of look at this as like following the smart money. The whales tend to know what they're doing. They tend to distribute in the times of strength and accumulate during times of market weakness. So seeing this level of buying conviction come in below 100K is actually somewhat of a validating bullish sign for me. I think that seeing this mark uh, coincide directly with the dip below 100K, that in conjunction with the options data, which shows strong uh, put buying demand at around the 95 to 100K level. I think those two things in conjunction tell us that we might be actually reaching a local bottom here, and we might see price climb higher in the interim because of the number of large buyers and large speculators coming back into this market. They tend to not be wrong. As you can see from this chart, when the long buyers step in, that tends to be a good time to accumulate. So if you have been accumulating Bitcoin alongside these buyers, I don't think that's necessarily a bad move whatsoever. I think that you can go ahead and take a look at this chart and justify a long position anything below 100K. So um, would love to go into more into depth with some on-chain stuff, but I'll save that for our webinar later this week. For those of you that don't know, CJ and I are launching the Cryptx service here at Sticky Trades. We have a Telegram group that is open. You can try it for free for 15 days, and you can pick our brains, ask us questions, and just look for insights. We publish actionable trade insights on a regular basis, so you definitely don't want to miss those. So join our Telegram group. But CJ, I know that you had mentioned in our leading up to this show that you wanted to talk a little bit about the broader markets as well. And you had mentioned the DXY. And I'm really glad you did because I actually also wanted to touch on this today. I think it's worth mentioning. But go ahead and segue into the DXY if you don't mind.
I will. I first want to mention, if we're on the theme of broader markets, the concept of news failure and just what we want to see in healthy bull markets. In healthy bull markets, you want to see beta and the NASDAQ lead. And
Right.
that's just not what we've seen since Palantir's earnings. They had a really bullish earnings call, but the fact that price couldn't rally, I think shows that a lot of that AI hype as well as innovation is sort of been priced into the market, and we're seeing a little bit of reversal from that. Also, aside from the AI trade, in terms of the liquidity dynamic, if you look at the assets which are very prone to liquidity, namely Bitcoin, gold, and silver, they've all been having a pretty rough time. And while I do agree Bitcoin is oversold structurally, I do want to wait for a little bit more stability. Because looking out, I think a lot of people are really bullish for 2026 with the return of quantitative easing, but I'm a little bit more contrarian. I kind of want to hold the boat. A lot of these assets, I mean, just look at Robinhood up from, $10 to 120
Yeah.
this bull market. I never thought it would go past 60, to be perfectly honest with you, when looking back at it at 2023. But just that news failure coming off of Palantir, last week, I think is it's just the tape looks heavy. I said that last week, but that's kind of just the reality of what we're observing in the markets. It's what we have for us right now. In terms of the DXY, I will share my screen here because I think it does have the potential to be one of the asymmetric trades going into 2026, because when you think about narratives and sentiment and positioning and what we've seen over the course of the last year, and even the last few months, everybody has been extraordinarily bearish the dollar, not only from a sentiment perspective, but also from a positioning perspective, where, the whole world has been saying, you got to buy gold, you got to buy silver. The US dollar is going to zero, or, it's the whole debasement hedge trade. And while those fundamentals are, I'm not going to argue with that validity, but the market's just saying something different. Monday, September 15th, the US dollar bottomed on rate cuts. When you cut rates of a currency, that's typically bearish. And when the market is doing something opposed to the fundamentals, being that it's rallied ever since rate cuts, then that's the market telling me, well, the dollar has some underlying strength, and maybe those rate cuts were already priced in back in August and September. So looking at the DXY going into midterm election years, this is what we've seen historically when, trending up from bear market lows in the DXY. 2014, there was a rally of over 23% in the dollar currency index. Very similar price action in 2022. And actually, what I think we're most similar and what we're seeing right now is a pattern that we might see in 2018, which is, the dollar index had a really good start to that year. I think that's maybe what we should expect going into the midterm election year of 2026. And today, the dollar actually did something that I've been waiting to see from it, which is it actually went up while risk assets and stocks went down, right? And that goes back to the whole gold thing and silver. So I think this is a very contrarian trade. And in my mind, the vast majority of people, there's so many reasons to be bearish USD, but it's just not it's not trading according to the fundamentals, and that's always something I like to point at and pay attention to. So I'm pretty bullish DXY going into next year. As of now, we'll see.
Yeah. And I guess just to wrap things up, what do you think that would mean for Bitcoin, or what has that meant historically when we see bullish price action out of the DXY? Can you kind of tell us what that might mean for the price action of Bitcoin and the crypto market in general?
Yes. So historically, there's been an inverse relationship between the liquidity trades like silver, gold, Bitcoin, even stocks, I say, would be somewhat of a debasement trade. But interestingly, the US dollar has actually been going up with stocks over the last month, which traditionally has happened at the end of bull markets, like in 2022. I remember the DXY, or excuse me, the end of 2021. That's when the DXY really bottomed and started accelerating. So they're inverse correlated assets. If the DXY does go up, I think it's going to be very difficult for stuff like Bitcoin and everything that's encompassed in the liquidity trade. And I think that's what we're beginning to see here in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, it looks like it. Like you said, the tape looks heavy, and you're seeing that play out with a lot of different assets. I want to give kind of a shorter term outlook on some of the altcoins that we've been talking about with some of the members of our community. And if you want more of this, like I said, CJ and I are doing this on a daily basis in the Telegram group. So definitely head over there and check that out. But I want to talk about ETH because we talked a lot about Bitcoin and where we saw Bitcoin getting accumulated. I showed this chart here where we saw long-term accumulation from big holders coming in at below the 100K level. We're seeing something comparable happening here with ETH. Anything below 3K is getting bought up very quickly. And I like how this is setting up from a technical perspective. We have this level acting as resistance here, support here, and now I expect it to act as support once again here. We can get a brief bounce up to the moving average, but I wouldn't expect anything too much more than that. That is still a pretty significant move, a nice little move to the upside here of just a slight move. And, I think that this is something that could pan out in a matter of days here. We are widely diverged from the moving average. The RSI is showing signs of a double bottom. And lastly, one thing I think could be a contributing factor to positive price action in Bitcoin and ETH is the rotation of capital out of some of the altcoins that have really pumped. One great example is Zcash. And, AJ will tell you this, whenever you see a double top in price and you see the RSI looking like this, where the relative strength is much greater at that first peak than it is at the second peak, that's a sign of weakness. And I think we see some downward price action for Zcash. And I think we see this capital actually rotate back into some of the larger cap coins like ETH and like Bitcoin. So this has been a nice run. Based on what I'm seeing from the RSI, I would not long this here. In fact, I'd consider potentially shorting it with a stop just above the local swing high. And I think this is one that could pan out in a matter of days here. It moved very quickly to the upside, and as a result, I think it will move very quickly to the downside as well. So keep an eye on that. And like I said, we're always updating our community on these trades and a whole lot more in our Telegram and with our Cryptx service. So definitely check that out at stickytrades.com/Cryptx. That's all I got for today. CJ, is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap things up?
Yeah, for sure. I took a small short in Zcash today,
Nice.
based on, we'll see, how the daily candle closes. But the way I do it in terms of, structuring risk and reward in the perpetual futures is I just did a 3x leveraged short on that one. Liquidation price, I think, is about 800. So If that hits, that'll just be my stop loss. But I think there's plenty of, can give it plenty of room to the upside, and ultimately we'll see. But it looks like it's starting to break, right? And one of the interesting things about Zcash is it's actually been trading inverse to Bitcoin over the last couple of days, where it's been going up. And this morning, or last night, when Bitcoin kind of started going up a little bit, trying to find a bottom, Zcash was actually seeing weakness. So I think you're absolutely right about that rotation of capital and people just kind of taking risk off the table. I mean, come on, it's been up from 50 to like 750, and
if you're long in here, that's just greedy.
Yeah, of course. And I think that could be said for a lot of the other assets and even many stocks out there. Like I had a friend who actually asked for my advice, and a couple other people, because he had bought Robinhood stock at 50, and he put like a good amount for him in it, and just sold it the other day for about whatever Robinhood's trading at, about 125 or 120 now. But like, it's just this late in the cycle, it's difficult for me to take high conviction long positions. And I kind of just want to wait for a little bit more market stability. So we'll see. But maybe we'll hit some questions here if we've got time to end.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do it. Let's run through some questions. So just running through some comments here. You guys can write 65K Bitcoin, but 65K in Bitcoin, not yet. Perhaps end of cycle. If we see that move in the DXY that CJ was talking about, I think it's certainly possible. Could the sell-off be due to margin calls? There's definitely some of that happening. Liquidations occurring that's driving price. I think you'll see a lot of that happening with Zcash as some of the longs get liquidated and you see price start to drop due to those liquidations. So that's definitely a good point. What is a good Web3 wallet? I just use MetaMask, but there's lots of good options out there. CJ?
Yeah, I mean, I still use MetaMask. I'm pretty disappointed that they haven't really innovated in the last few years. I think they could be doing a lot better when you compare it to competitors like Phantom. But it's just been the first one, so I haven't changed it. I still use MetaMask, and it works fine. In terms of BT, because I see that's another question, I just pulled up the chart. Obviously, very widely diverged from the moving average. But this late in the cycle, especially with stocks beginning to roll over, I just kind of want to back off. And like to me, buying Bitcoin here is kind of like shorting an asset that's making all-time highs. It's just the momentum is so reflexive to the downside that it's like, let's just wait for some stability. And I just am not totally seeing it yet. So just kind of want to preserve capital. And in terms of being towards the end of the cycle, like we are approaching the end of Q4, which is when traditionally cycles end going into the midterm election year for Bitcoin. So this late in the cycle, I just don't have a lot of conviction in terms of risk to reward to the upside.
Yeah, I'm with you there. And this week's webinar, I want to go in depth into Bitcoin related options and some of the puts that you can buy in some of these various companies that I think could pay off in the short to long term here. If we do get a pullback in Bitcoin, there's plenty of different vehicles for trading Bitcoin now that aren't just directly Bitcoin. And I think harvesting some premium on some of these options right now is actually a very valid strategy. And even if you're just buying puts to protect against your Bitcoin HODL stack, I think that it's a very viable move at our current point in the marketplace. So this Thursday's webinar, I'm going to go into depth. I want to talk about Riot. I want to talk about Mara. I want to talk about BTBT. I want to talk about BTBX and a lot more. So going to be a very options heavy episode this Thursday, but knowing you guys and the background you have from AJ, I think it will resonate with you a lot and you'll kind of see a lot of the opportunities that I'm talking about here.
Yeah, well, we're looking forward to that. Absolutely. And hope to see you guys there tomorrow. Don't forget, check out stickytrades.com/Cryptx. Get a 2-week free trial, and we'd love to have you on board. But with that being said, take care, guys, and hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks.